Imagine a winding dirt road in the pitch black of night. It is 1938, deep in the foothills of North Carolina. The air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. But if you listen closely, you can hear something else. A low rumble in the distance. That isn't thunder. It is a modified Ford V8 coupe, tearing through the switchbacks with its headlights off. The driver is navigating by memory and moonlight, and he isn't alone. Behind him, maybe a mile back, are the headlights of a federal revenue agent, the revenuers. They are chasing a car weighed down with 100 gallons of illegal white whiskey. If the driver gets caught, he loses the car, the cargo, and his freedom. If he makes the run, he makes a month's wages in a single night. This high-stakes game of cat and mouse didn't just fill mason jars. It built the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar sport. Welcome to the story of how the backwoods of Appalachia gave birth to the high banks of Daytona. This is the story of how Moonshine created NASCAR. To understand stock car racing, we really have to understand the geography and the economics of the American South, don't we? It seems odd to link a high-speed sport to agricultural economics. It does, but the connection is direct. You have to go back way before the 1930s. We are talking about the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s. The Scots-Irish immigrants who settled in Appalachia brought a very specific skill with them, distilling grain into whiskey. And for them, it wasn't just a vice, it was a preservation method. If you were a farmer in the mountains, getting a wagon load of corn to market before it rots is a nightmare. The roads were terrible. Exactly. A horse can carry 4 bushels of corn, but if you convert that corn into whiskey, a horse can carry the equivalent of 24 bushels. It was value-added agriculture. But then the federal government decided to tax it, and the mountain folk said absolutely not. That tax resistance is culturally embedded in the region. Fast forward to 1920 and Prohibition hits. Suddenly, this regional squabble over taxes turns into a nationwide demand for illegal liquor. That is the spark. Prohibition made moonshine incredibly profitable, but you had to move the product from the hidden stills in the mountains to the speakeasies in the cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, and Knoxville. That required a vehicle, and not just any vehicle. These runners needed cars that looked like your grandmother's sedan on the outside, but ran like a race car on the inside. This is where the engineering genius comes in. The holy grail was the 1932 Ford V8, the Deuce Coupe. It was the first affordable car with a V8 engine. It was light, it was fast, and it was easily modified. But the runners had a problem: weight. Right, liquid is heavy. If you put 100 gallons of moonshine in the trunk and back seat, the rear bumper is going to be dragging on the asphalt. That is a dead giveaway to any cop watching the road. So the mechanics became wizards of suspension. They would add extra leaf springs to the rear suspension to handle the load. They installed heavy-duty truck springs so the car would sit level even when it was fully loaded. Which meant, of course, that when the car was empty, the back end sat incredibly high. It was a telltale sign if you knew what to look for. They also bored out the cylinders to increase displacement. They added multiple carburetors. These guys were hot rodding decades before the term hot rod was popular in California. They were squeezing every ounce of horsepower out of those flathead engines because their liberty depended on it. I've read stories about the trippers, the cars designed specifically to distract the police. They weren't just fast, they were outfitted like something out of a James Bond movie.
Oh, absolutely. They had switches on the dashboard to cut the taillights so they could disappear into the dark. Some had steel plates welded behind the driver's seat to stop bullets. There were even legends of cars equipped with devices to release oil slicks or smoke screens, though that might be more folklore than fact. But the brake upgrades and engine tuning were very real. So you have a generation of young men, mostly in their early 20s, driving supercharged cars on treacherous roads every night. What happens when they aren't working? Ego happens. Competition happens. These runners took immense pride in their equipment. On Sunday afternoons, when the bootlegging paused, they would gather in open fields or cow pastures. The classic argument, my Ford is faster than your Chevrolet, or I made it from Wilkesboro to Charlotte in 2 hours flat. Exactly. They needed to prove it. So a farmer would plow a crude oval into a dirt field and they would race. At first, it was just for bragging rights, but then people started showing up to watch. It makes sense. It was the Depression. People didn't have money for entertainment. But watching the local bad boys, who were often seen as Robin Hood figures because they supplied the whiskey, drift around a dirt track, that was exciting. The crowds grew massive. We're talking about thousands of people showing up to a random field in Georgia or North Carolina. Promoters realized they could charge admission, and the drivers realized they could win prize money, who were the stars of this era before it was official. You have to talk about Lloyd C. He was perhaps the archetypal moonshine racer. He was from Dawsonville, Georgia. He was young, incredibly handsome, and drove like a maniac. He would win a race on Sunday afternoon and then use that same car to run liquor on Sunday night. There is that famous story about C winning a race after sleeping in his car the night before because he was hiding from the police. That's the one. He won the National Stock Car Championship at Lakewood Speedway in Atlanta in 1941. He was the sport's first true superstar. Tragically, he was shot and killed by his own cousin in a dispute over sugar, the raw material for moonshine, just a day after that victory. He was only 21. That highlights just how rough this world was. It wasn't a sanitized sport. It was violent and dangerous, and the racing itself was chaotic. There were no uniform rules. It was the Wild West. One track might pay the winner, another might run off with the money. One track allowed modified engines, another wanted stock engines. Drivers would cheat constantly. They would use lighter frames, illegal fuel additives, anything to win. And into this chaos steps a man named Bill France Sr. He wasn't a moonshiner, was he? No, Bill France was a mechanic and a gas station owner who moved to Daytona Beach from Washington, D.C. He was a racer himself, but his real genius was organization. He saw these scattered, chaotic races and saw a potential gold mine, but he knew it couldn't survive as a criminal pastime. He realized that to get big sponsors and national attention, you couldn't have drivers getting arrested for felonies on their way to the track. Precisely. The turning point was the realization that the stock car needed to be defined. The fans loved seeing cars that looked like the ones they could buy at the dealership. They wanted to see a Ford beat a Chevy. It validated their own consumer choices. So how do we get from the cow pastures to an actual organization? The date is December 14th, 1947. Bill France Sr. gathers drivers, mechanics, and promoters at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach. He lays down the law. He wants a unified set of rules, a guaranteed purse for drivers, and a points championship. And that is the birth of the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR. Yes, the first strictly stock race was held in Charlotte in 1949, and guess who won? A bootlegger named Glenn Dunaway. But here is the irony. He was disqualified after the race.
Why? Because he was a criminal?
No, because of his car.
Technical inspectors found he had wedged the rear springs to make the car handle better, a classic moonshiner trick called spreading the springs. NASCAR took the win away and gave it to Jim Roper. It was a signal. The outlaw days were over. We are playing by the rulebook now. But they couldn't get rid of the moonshiners entirely. They were the best drivers. We have to talk about Junior Johnson. Junior Johnson is the bridge between the two worlds. He was a legendary runner in Wilkes County. He famously invented the bootleg turn, where you spin the car 180 degrees in a single motion to reverse direction instantly. He didn't just race, he lived the life. He actually went to prison, didn't he? During his racing career? He did. In 1956, federal agents caught him at his father's still. He spent 11 months in a federal penitentiary in Ohio. When he got out, he went right back to racing. He won the Daytona 500 in 1960. He became the face of the sport's rebellious roots. And eventually, he was pardoned by President Reagan, which really symbolizes the full acceptance of NASCAR into mainstream America. That transition was difficult. For decades, the corporations were wary. Ford and GM were hesitant to support a sport with such criminal ties. But the fan base was undeniable. The same skills that allowed a driver to navigate a dirt road at 100 miles per hour with the lights off made for incredible television. The skills of the mechanic became the skills of the pit crew. The innovation of the Bootlight Garage became the multi-million-dollar R&D centers we see today in Mooresville, North Carolina. North Wilkesboro Speedway, one of the original tracks, sits right in the heart of moonshine country. When you look at the early champions, Red Byron, Tim Flock, Curtis Turner, so many of them had ties to the whiskey trade. They were adrenaline junkies who found a way to monetize their addiction to speed legally. It is fascinating that the stock car concept was so important. The bootleggers needed cars that looked stock to blend in. The race fans wanted cars that looked stock to relate to them. It was a perfect convergence. And as the sport grew, the moonshine dried up. Better roads, cheaper legal liquor, and stricter enforcement ended the golden age of bootlegging. But the culture of the car remained.
The Southern identity became wrapped in the combustion engine. Today, NASCAR is a corporate juggernaut with sponsors from Wall Street and Silicon Valley. The cars are technological marvels that share almost nothing with street vehicles. But if you go to a race and you smell the high-octane fuel, and you feel the ground shake as the pack goes by, you are feeling the ghosts of the Ridge Runners. You are witnessing a sport that wasn't built in a boardroom, but forged in the fire of a copper still and hammered out in a hidden garage under the cover of darkness. The outlaw spirit never really left. It just got a sponsorship deal. To truly understand how a criminal enterprise morphed into a professional sport, we have to pop the hood. We have to look at the mechanical alchemy that was happening in barns and hidden garages all across Wilkes County, North Carolina, and Dawsonville, Georgia. The bootleggers weren't just drivers. They were brilliant, intuitive engineers. And necessity was the mother of that invention. You have to remember the stakes. If you were caught, you weren't just getting a speeding ticket. You were losing your car, your cargo, which was worth a small fortune, and you were going to federal prison. So the car had to be faster than the government's car. That was the only rule that mattered. Exactly. And the canvas for this art form was almost exclusively the Ford, specifically the 1939 and 1940 Ford Coupes. Now, why was that the vehicle of choice? It wasn't just brand loyalty.
It was the engine, the Ford Flathead V8. When Henry Ford introduced that V8 in 1932, he unknowingly gave organized crime its greatest tool. It was affordable, it was durable, and most importantly, it was incredibly easy to modify. By the late 1940s, these backwoods mechanics were squeezing horsepower out of those engines that Detroit engineers hadn't even dreamed of. Let's talk about those modifications. We aren't talking about a simple tune-up. These guys were boring out the cylinders to increase displacement. They were shaving the cylinder heads to boost compression ratios. They were installing multiple carburetors, what they called tri-power setups, to dump more fuel into the engine. And they were sourcing parts from all over. They'd take a crankshaft from a Mercury engine because it had a longer stroke, which gave them more torque. They needed that torque to pull a heavy load of White Lightning up a steep mountain grade without losing speed. It was a Frankenstein approach to engine building, but it worked beautifully. But here's the catch, and this is where the stock car concept really originates. The car had to look bone stock on the outside. It had to be a sleeper. If a federal agent, a revenuer, saw a car with a chopped roof or fancy wheels, they'd pull it over immediately. So the exterior had to look like something your grandmother would drive to church. That was the deception. And the hardest part of that deception was hiding the weight. A typical run might involve hauling 100 to 150 gallons of moonshine. That is roughly 1,000 pounds of liquid weight in the trunk and back seat. Think about what happens to a normal car when you put 1,000 pounds in the trunk. The rear bumper jogs on the pavement, the nose points up at the sky. It's a dead giveaway. So the mechanics developed heavy-duty suspension systems. They would take stiff springs from trunk chassis or even police cruisers and install them in the rear. They installed extra leaf springs. But then when the car was empty, the rear end would sit way too high because the springs were so stiff. Right, so they had to be clever. Some of them devised ratcheting mechanisms or chains to hold the suspension down when it was empty, so it looked level. Then when they loaded it up, they'd release the tension, and the car would settle into a normal ride height. It was engineering genius born out of total paranoia. And inside the car, they gutted everything. They ripped out the back seats to make room for the mason jars or the metal cans. They installed kill switches for the brake lights. That was a classic move. You're being chased down a winding mountain road at night. You hit the brakes for a sharp turn, but if your brake lights flare up, the cop behind you sees the turn coming. So they wired a switch to cut the rear lights. The driver could slam on the brakes in total darkness. The agent behind him wouldn't see the deceleration or the curve until it was too late. He'd go flying off the side of the mountain while the bootlegger vanished into the woods. This brings us to the driving itself. We talk about the cars, but the men driving them were developing skills that didn't exist in professional racing at the time. IndyCar drivers were used to paved ovals and banking. These boys were driving on dirt, gravel, and mud at night with no headlights at speeds exceeding 100 miles an hour. This is where the famous bootlegger turn comes from. It's basically a J-turn. You're heading down a narrow road, you see a roadblock ahead. You can't stop. So you slam the transmission into second, crank the wheel hard left, hit the handbrake to lock the rear wheels, and the car spins a perfect 180 degrees. You stomp on the gas, and you're gone in the other direction before the dust even settles.
Junior Johnson was the master of this. He famously said that he learned to drive by hauling whiskey out of Wilkes County. He said, if you can drive a car with a load of whiskey on it, you can drive a race car. The physics of driving a heavy, unstable car on loose dirt taught them car control that was simply superior to anything else out there. And inevitably, this competitiveness spilled over. You have all these young men full of adrenaline, cash in their pockets from selling shine, and they all think they have the fastest car. It wasn't enough to beat the cops. They wanted to beat each other. That's the pivot point. It started in the cow pastures. On Sunday afternoons, after church, the bootleggers would gather at a flat piece of land. They'd mark out a track, usually an oval, and they would race. It wasn't for trophies back then. It was for bragging rights and cash bets. The earliest tracks were brutal. There were no guardrails. The spectators would stand right at the edge of the dirt. If a car lost control, it went into the crowd. But the excitement was electric. People had never seen cars move like this. And the stars of these early unauthorized races were the same guys whose names were on the FBI's most wanted lists. Lloyd Seay is the name that always comes up here. He is arguably the first true superstar of stock car racing, before NASCAR even existed. He was from Dawsonville, Georgia. He was handsome, reckless, and fast. He drove for his cousin, Raymond Parks, who was the biggest moonshine kingpin in Georgia. Raymond Parks is a crucial figure. He was the money man. He wasn't a mechanic and he wasn't a driver, but he was a businessman. He had made a fortune in the numbers racket and moonshine, and he funneled that money into building the best cars. He hired the best mechanics like Red Vogt. Red Vogt was the Da Vinci of the flathead engine. The team of Parks, Vogt, and Seay was unstoppable. In 1941, Lloyd Seay won a major race at Lakewood Speedway in Atlanta. He drove to the track in the same car he'd used to run liquor the night before. He won the race, flipped the car twice during the event, still won, and then the next day, tragically, he was dead. That story is a stark reminder of the violence of that world. Seay wasn't killed in a car crash. He was shot by his own cousin in a dispute over a sugar bill, sugar being the main ingredient for moonshine. He was 21 years old. It underscored that while the racing was fun, the business behind it was deadly serious. This chaos is what set the stage for Bill France Sr. By the late 1940s, stock car racing was popular, but it was a mess. Promoters would skip town with the prize money. Tracks were inconsistent. Rules varied from town to town. If you won a race, you might get paid, or you might get stiffed. Big Bill France was a mechanic and a driver himself, but he realized the real money was in organization. He saw this scattered collection of outlaws and realized it could be a national sport if someone just enforced some rules. He moved to Daytona Beach, which was already famous for land speed record attempts, and started promoting races on the beach road course. The beach course was legendary. One leg of the track was the paved highway A1A, and the other leg was the actual beach sand. The turns were these rutted, dangerous transitions between pavement and sand. But France knew he needed more than just a beach race. He needed a governing body. So in December 1947, France called a meeting at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach. He invited the top drivers, mechanics, and car owners, most of whom were deeply involved in the illegal whiskey trade. It must have been an incredible room to be in. You had guys who were literally hiding from the law, sitting down to write a law book for racing.
It wasn't an easy sell. These men were naturally anti-authority. That's why they were moonshiners. They didn't like being told what to do. But France convinced them that if they wanted to make real money, legitimate money, they needed a sanctioning body. They needed guaranteed purses. They needed a season championship. That meeting is where the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR, was born. And France was smart. He knew the appeal of the sport was the stock aspect. He insisted on the strictly stock division. He wanted fans to see the exact same car they could buy at a dealership racing on the track. He famously said, "Win on Sunday, sell on Monday." The first strictly stock race was held in Charlotte in 1949, and fittingly, it ended in a controversy involving bootlegger engineering. A driver named Glenn Dunaway won the race by 3 laps. He dominated. But after the race, the officials inspected his car. They found that he had wedged wooden blocks into the rear springs to stiffen the suspension. It was an old moonshiner trick to improve handling in the corners. Bill France disqualified him immediately. It was a massive statement. It said, "The outlaw days are over. We play by the rules now." Dunaway actually sued NASCAR, but the court upheld France's decision. That legal victory solidified NASCAR's authority. But let's be honest, France publicly cracked down on cheating, but privately he knew the outlaw image sold tickets. He needed those personalities. And no personality was bigger than Junior Johnson. If Lloyd Seay was the early martyr, Junior Johnson was the living legend.
Junior was the real deal. His father was a moonshiner. His house was raided constantly. Junior spent his youth outrunning the police on the back roads of North Carolina. He wasn't just a driver, he was part of the culture. In 1955, the federal government finally caught him, not in a car, but at his father's still. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison in Chillicothe, Ohio. Think about that for a second. One of the rising stars of a major sport was pulled off the circuit to serve time for making illegal whiskey. Today, that would end a career. Back then, it just made him more popular. The fans loved him because he was one of them. He was fighting the system. When Junior got out, he came back with a vengeance, and he brought that bootlegger ingenuity to the superspeedways. In 1960, at the Daytona 500, Junior was driving a Chevrolet that was slower than the Pontiacs. He knew he couldn't beat them on raw speed, but during practice, he noticed something. He realized that if he tucked his car right behind the car in front of him, the air pressure changed. The lead car would punch a hole in the air, and Junior's car would get sucked into that vacuum. He could go faster than he could on his own, and the lead car would actually go faster too because the drag was reduced. He had discovered drafting. He used that technique to win the 1960 Daytona 500 despite having a slower car. That is the bootlegger mindset perfectly encapsulated. Find an edge, exploit the physics, and outsmart the guy with the bigger budget. Drafting is now a fundamental part of motorsport, but it was discovered by a whiskey runner trying to keep up. As the 1960s rolled on, the corporate money started to pour in. The car manufacturers, Ford, Chrysler, GM, realized that NASCAR was a marketing goldmine. They started pumping millions into factory teams. The sport began to professionalize. The drivers started wearing uniforms instead of t-shirts. The dirt tracks were paved over with asphalt. But the tension between the clean corporate image and the dirty bootleg roots remained. Bill France spent years trying to scrub the redneck image from the sport to attract sponsors like Winston and later Nextel. He wanted to distance NASCAR from the Moonshine runners, but he couldn't erase history.